Hello everyone, and welcome to a video all about how you can get started with crochet. Now, crochet has been an extremely popular hobby since the dawn of time, it feels like, but it has certainly enjoyed something of a revival quite recently. And if you're one of these people who is looking to take your first steps in this delightful pastime, then what are you going to need to get started? And arguably one of the loveliest things about crochet is that you need very little in order to get started. Pretty much just some yarn that you like the look of and an appropriately sized hook. And so let's take a look at each one of these in turn. Now, by far the most common type of hook you're going to come across is called the overhang or the tapered hook. And these have that very classic crochet hook shape that has a shaft that gets a little bit narrower towards the hook. And then the hook itself curves over so that the tip isn't actually in line with the shaft when it finishes. In a good quality hook, you should find that the hook itself isn't actually any wider than the shaft, and it should also have a nice pointy tip that's easy to push in between gaps in the yarn, but not so sharp that it's going to split the yarn apart. Also be aware that as these hooks are by far the most common and they tend to be the most popular, they can unfortunately also swing wildly in their quality. And I often see budget range hooks that have very poor quality joints in the crook of the hook. That's where the hook actually bends over. These rough bits may not look like much, but they can snag on your work, making little pulls and drags that gives the overall cloth a very scruffy appearance. A good quality hook should be completely smooth from shaft to tip. Any hook can also either have an ergonomic handle or just the plain shaft, and which one you use is entirely up to you. I tend to find that for shorter periods where I'm crocheting for perhaps just an hour or so, then I'm absolutely fine with the simple shaft hooks, but any longer than that my hand can start to ache a little bit as it's moving around. And here is where the ergonomic handles come into themselves, as they do alleviate that to some extent. But it really does depend very much on you trying different styles and finding one that suits you best. And the other type of hooks to look out for are inline hooks. These are usually made from a single shaft that has had a notch cut out so that you can use that to grab hold of the yarn. And as you can see, the tip of this hook is now in line with that shaft. And this is supposed to mean that your work is neater, as the hook doesn't stretch the yarn as you push and pull it through the gaps. But I do often find that these inline hooks are just that little bit more fiddly to use, and they can take a moment to get used to, and especially if you're already used to an overhang hook. And in all honesty, I haven't found that they make that much difference to my final product. Perhaps it is fractionally neater, but as I find the hooks slightly awkward, I tend to just stick to the overhang or tapered hooks. But much like handle design, it is very much a case of each to their own, and just bear in mind that you will find there is a certain amount of snobbery in crochet, with people crowing over one brand and dismissing others. But ultimately, all that matters is what you find comfortable to use, and if it's at a sensible price for yourself. Hooks do come in a fairly set sizing. They are measured by diameter in millimeters. And so usually between 3 and 10 millimeter sizes, they will go up in increments of 0.5. So 4 millimeters, 4.5 millimeters, 5 millimeters, and so on. And then there are more sizes in the hooks under 3 millimeters in diameter, with increments of 0.25 millimeters instead. So you'll have a 2 millimeter hook, a 2.25 millimeter, a 2.5 millimeter, and so on. And it's because these very, very tiny hooks are used to create doilies and lacework that use very fine yarns, and so they have very small hooks with only teensy-weensy little differences between them. Also, after saying all that, it is worth being aware that sizing in crochet hooks tends not to be particularly good. A 5.5mm in one brand might be just fractionally different from another, but over the course of a whole blanket or a jumper, for example, you will really notice the different quality that this gives the crocheted material. And so when you start a project, try not to change your hook halfway through if you can possibly help it, as you will be able to tell if that hook was fractionally larger, then the created material will feel slightly looser, whereas if the new hook is fractionally smaller, then it's going to be a slightly tighter feeling material. And as I'm sure you can tell, there are a plethora of hooks out there, and this is because there is a plethora of different crafters out there, and it really is a case of just trying out different styles of hooks in different brands to find the ones that work for you. And even then, the likely chance are you're going to end up with a mix of different brands for each and every hook size. I use Knit Pro Waves for my 5.5, but I wouldn't be without my Clover 4mm, and I am perfectly happy with this cheapy 6.5mm I got free along with 10 others in a magazine one time. The more you crochet, you will find what suits your style. But what are you going to be crocheting, as the size of hook you want will depend on the yarn that you're going to be using, as size relates to thickness of yarn. A fine yarn, such as sock yarn for example, will likely require a hook size between 2 and 3mm, while chunky yarn will likely need a hook size more like 6, 7 or 8mm and so on. And when you buy commercial yarn, it will usually give you a sizing guide, at least giving you a rough idea of which hooks you should be using for this size of yarn. And if there isn't one specifically for crochet, then you can use the sizing guide for needles as well. Now, that's assuming that you're using commercial yarn, but what if you're not? What if you're using an art yarn that either you or somebody else has spun for you? Then sizing can be a tad more challenging. But generally speaking, to work out what size of hook you need, you can just lay the yarn over the top of the hook, and keeping the yarn completely relaxed, no stretching in it at all, it should just cover the gap where the hook bends over. If when you're looking at that yarn it seems to have a lot of space around it, then the likely chances are you need a smaller hook. And if the yarn is much wider than the gap, then you're going to be needing a bigger one. And what you use for yarn can be very creative with crochet. Yarn can be woolen or cotton or acrylic, depending on what it is you prefer. And when you're choosing yarn, it's worth taking a bit of a notice at what ply has been used, with ply being the number of individual threads that have been twisted together to make the completed yarn. So this is a 4-ply. You can see that it has 4 individual threads in there that have been used to make the one complete yarn, whereas this one is a 2-ply. The higher number of ply usually makes a yarn look rounder and fatter, and so that it looks a bit more like a cord. And this style suits crochet really well because it shows up the intricate loops and knots that you've created. Again though, having said that, this is very much your project, not mine, and if a nice fluffy 2-ply yarn takes your fancy, then use that and match your hook up to it. Once you have chosen your yarn, then it's time to learn how to hold it, and this is important. But there are many different ways to do so, and so if my method doesn't work for you, then just simply hunt around on the internet and you will find other methods from other crocheters. But in order to crochet, you need to hold your yarn in a way that's going to allow you to manipulate it with the hook without it being too floppy or fiddly or getting too tight. You need to hold your hook in your dominant hand and your yarn in your subordinate hand. And what I do is I tend to wrap the yarn around my 4th or ring finger and then over my 1st finger so that I can use it to pull it up like so. This leaves my thumb and the 2 remaining fingers free to hold the crochet. And so when the yarn is attached to the project, as you can see here, I can use my 1st finger to keep just a little bit of tension on the yarn so that I can grab it easily with the hook and then pull it through nicely. And with the wrap around my 4th finger, that means that the yarn coming from the ball is under enough tension so that it's not flopping about all over the place. And when you need more yarn, you can simply tug on your finger and it pulls a little bit more away from the ball. This looks fiddly, and in all honesty, it is. This isn't something you'll be able to do immediately if you've never picked up crochet before, but I would say that in all of crochet, this manipulation of the yarn and keeping enough tension in it is by far the most complex part of the whole operation, and it's also the most time-consuming to get used to in the hobby. But you will get used to it, and you'll do so quite quickly, and you'll also find a way that works for you. But once you have your yarn, your hook, and you're holding it in a way that you find comfortable, then it's time to start practicing your first stitches, and we will get started on those in the next video. For now though, I hope you've enjoyed this little video all about starting crocheting. Happy crafting everyone, and I will see you again soon.